Hello all, and I'm back with part 2 of my analysis of the Dialed Arxos Bowsight. As usual, it takes me a while to find time to make my videos between filling orders and things breaking in my house. It's been a very expensive summer. The last 3 months have been very busy, and I am thankful for, it's been a mixed bag of good and bad. So these are my findings regarding the Dialed Arxos after a number of range sessions with it and shooting it from 10 yards up to 60. I haven't gotten to use it farther than that yet, but I think this should give me enough data that I need to share some observations. I'll probably mix in some B-roll of myself at the range to juxtapose me sitting in this chair. So there'll be a little bit of that too, so it won't just be me talking into the camera. I've heard a few people mention that the engineers at Dialed Archery are listening to feedback from customers and reviewers, and they are making efforts to update the site and adjust or modify the feature set to increase overall satisfaction. That being said, I can't find anything from Dialed that actually highlights the things that they are changing. Supposedly the wheel tensioner, which is actually called the dial brake, or dial lock, is being tweaked so it actually functions as a lock in newer models that are coming out. Other than that, I don't know what else they're working on. The only things I see from them on their social media are new colors and patterns for the site and the void dial, and I cannot express how little I care about limited edition accessories. If they are making improvements, I would like to see any upgrades and parts be made available to customers who purchased earlier versions of the site. That is, if those parts are drop-in and don't require modification of the frame. As far as observations, here's what I found after spending some time with it. The first thing I noticed spending more time at the range with this site is it is significantly easier to turn the dial when it is actually attached to something, and it feels smoother and easier to rotate and make precise movements. So guys at Dialed Archery, if you're watching this, buy some old bows, strip them down to their risers, mount your display models to the risers, and then show them off like that. It would provide a much more realistic impression of how your sight is going to perform on a bow, because when you're holding it, it's harder to get an impression of how hard the dial is to turn when you're actually holding onto the back of the sight. And a lot of people harp on the stiffness of the dial, while now I think of it as a non-issue now that I've actually had it on a bow. Regarding the dial brake or dial lock, which is what they call the tensioner, I spent about 6 range sessions with it, and I didn't use it once. The dial hasn't actually moved from the yardage, or whatever yardage I've set it on, with the dial brake disengaged, so I never felt any need to use it. I do check my yardages between ends in case it does shift, especially when I switch from switch between targets. I'm sure none of us have forgotten to switch from 60 back down to 20 at some point in our arrow flinging careers. I would say that under normal use, the dial brake is still redundant in its current form. Being able to press it down and just make it slightly harder to turn is just, it's something that needs improvement. It looks like I actually got this one wrong from part 1 regarding the Arxos not having a tension adjustment on the rail. There are 2 tiny set screws on the scope side of the frame that can adjust the tension on the rail. They sit on top of 2 plastic pieces that sit in this groove and press against the rail to determine how much force is needed to turn the dial. They also function as stoppers and stop the rail at the top and bottom limit of its travel. If you unscrew them until there are threads exposed, the dial becomes easier to turn, still a little stiff. If you tighten them down a bit, the dial becomes very hard to turn, and having plastic parts rubbing against the Cerakote probably means those little pieces or the Cerakote itself may wear down over time. This one already has marks forming, and it's becoming lighter than the Cerakote around it. After spending some time with them, though, I am finding they are pretty much all or nothing with no steps in between, so I ended up loosening them to where they're just kind of sitting there. Like I said, they're kind of useless. So there is, but there isn't, a tensioning system. The indicator pins sit out too far from the sight tape to be able to get an accurate setting. They sit up roughly 1/16 of an inch or 1.6 millimeters above the sight tape ring, so the yardage at which it is pointing is highly dependent upon the angle at which you are looking at it. If I move the sight up or down, there can actually be up to a 2-yard difference above or below depending on how you look at it. Granted, that's also true of all movable sights, but the Arxos is way more pronounced than the others. Combine that with the yard's worth of slop in the dial, and setting an accurate yardage is not as easy as a sight with less to no play and a yardage pin that is sharper and sits closer to its tape. Now the big question of how much yardage you gain with the scope moving down and back with the Arxos is one I tested by sighting it in, selecting a tape, and measuring the distance between the pin and the top of the arrow shaft at various yardage settings at brace. For comparison, I did the same thing with a different sight. In this case, I used a redline torch, which I will be reviewing as well. I set the dovetail to a similar location as the Arxos, a similar length out in front of the riser, mounted it on the same bow, then sighted it in and selected the appropriate tape for that sight. Then I measured the distance from the pin to the top of the arrow at 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100 yards to see if there's a difference and how much. I did not check to make sure the arrow was perfectly level because that's kind of part of the game with it. Not everybody has perfect level nock travel out of the bow. I also chose the pin instead of the bottom of the scope because the diameters of the scopes are not the same, as well as their bubbles are in a different location, so it wouldn't be an accurate comparison. I also couldn't pull the tapes and compare them to each other because the diameter of the dials would have to be the same, and they are not. So measuring the fiber optic pin is what would give us the most accurate comparison. If the Arxos does what it advertises, it should have a taller gap than the torch, meaning more space between the bottom of between the pin and the top of the arrow. My arrows nocked at brace have a fairly significant knock high condition at the string, so they need to be tuned further, but I don't feel that should matter. However, I found out fairly quickly that it does matter, so I'm just going to put the numbers on the screen right here and then show what they are, because rattling them off isn't going to help much because they ended up being kind of meaningless. So as you can see, the angle of your arrow at brace will absolutely affect the measurement because the scopes are not descending and touching the same point on the arrow. That also potentially means that the benefits of the angled adjustment system may be dependent upon how well your bow is tuned. So the past hour I just spent bolting and unbolting these two sights off of that bow was kind of a waste of time. I went upstairs, cooked dinner, and came back down and tried something different. The arrow shelf on the PSE Mach 1 I'm using for evaluation purposes is level and parallel to the dovetail of the sight, so I held an arrow against the shelf and measured the 60-yard and 100-yard settings on both sights to remove the variable of a knock high condition. So while none of us plan on shooting off the shelf of our compound bows, I was really just looking for a consistent point of reference so I can, finish and move on to my next review. So the redline torch sight measured from the pin to an arrow leveled and parallel to the sight dovetail sitting on top of the arrow shelf at 60 yards was 3 3/8 of an inch, and at 100 yards was 2 9/16 of an inch. The dialed Arxos measured from pin to an arrow leveled and parallel to the sight dovetail sitting on top of the arrow shelf at 60 yards was 3 9/16 of an inch, and 2 5/16 of an inch at 100 yards. So from what I've measured, and this is not a scientific peer-reviewed study, at 60 yards, the torch, which only moves vertically, requires 3/16 of an inch additional movement downward to achieve the same yardage setting as the Arxos, and at 100 yards it required 1/4 of an inch additional downward movement to get the same yardage setting as the Arxos. To reiterate, that is with my particular setup, 60 pounds, 28.5 inch draw length, 400 grain, roughly 400 grain arrow, and assuming the arrow exits the bow dead nuts parallel to the sight. So the better your bow is tuned, the greater benefit you will see from using the sight with that particular feature. So there we have it. I can say with as much anecdotal certainty as anyone else that the angled elevation system does actually do something. Moving on. A couple things regarding their scopes. If you use the dialed scopes, and no, I will never call them mags, you get some extra arrow clearance from having the bubble level mounted to the top instead of the bottom. So that'll add an extra eighth to 3/16 of an inch of extra clearance on top of whatever the setup buys you from your angled elevation system. However, I found that tiny bubble level that's on these scopes to be hard to pick up through my peep sight, and now I understand why some brands like Shrewd and Redline employ oversized bubble levels instead of standard or little ones. The giant ones are easier to see in general, but they're also easier to pick up in your peripheral vision, so you can focus on your pin without having to shift your eyes to check your level. It's just one of those little things you don't think of. The pins in the scope of the Arxos scopes are bright enough without the need of a sight light, but they could definitely be brighter even with the rheostat fully opened. They don't have a lot of fiber to collect light as opposed to a scope with fiber that's wrapped around the outside. The pins on the Arxos work well enough in the conditions I was using them, which was outside during the middle of the day and also under stadium lighting. But if you immediately switch to one with a wrapped fiber, the difference in brightness is very, very noticeable. Like I said, they're good enough, but they could be better. So, in conclusion, overall impressions, the Dialed Arxos sight is nice, but it needs work. It's probably my favorite looking sight, but looks are not everything, and looks are also subjective. The angled elevation system does have a measurable effect, though it may only buy me an additional 5 yards or so with the setup in which I tested it. I would like to see a better locking system on the rail, and if I plan to continue using the frame, I would go with a different scope setup with brighter pins and a larger bubble. I would also like to see them refine the indicator pin area. It is bolted on, so they could very well add a magnifier or something on here to make it so that the pins are closer to the tape and easier to set a precise yardage. I find myself saying this a lot about the pieces of archery equipment coming out lately that have an above average price tag, and it turns out I'm going to end up saying it here again. There are less expensive options that perform just as well or better. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and happy hunting. Called the Tensioner. I spent about 6 range sessions with it. Sessions.